She walked into that courtroom with nothing but hope, and walked out with the world watching. What was supposed to be a simple hearing turned into a nightmare when the people meant to uphold justice crossed every line. In front of the entire courtroom, a black woman was humiliated, accused of something she didn't do, and then slapped, by the very officers sworn to protect her. The room went silent. Cameras flashed. But instead of breaking down, she looked straight ahead, calm, almost certain. No one in that room could have guessed what would happen next, or who she really was. Because within seconds, the tables would turn. The same men who mocked her would soon be standing at attention. And the woman they thought was powerless, was about to sit where justice itself is decided. What they didn't know that day was that the real judge hadn't even taken her seat yet. So before we begin, tell me, where are you watching this from right now? Because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. Her name was Danielle Harris, a quiet, determined woman who had built her life around fairness. Growing up in the South, she'd seen what injustice looked like up close. But she didn't let it break her. She studied harder, spoke softer, and carried herself with the kind of grace that made people listen before they judged. Every morning, she left her small apartment before sunrise, coffee in hand, files tucked under her arm, ready to face another day in the courthouse where she worked as a legal clerk. To most, Danielle was invisible, the one who organized paperwork, checked schedules, and made sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes. But what no one knew was that she'd recently been shortlisted for a major promotion, one that could finally put her in front of the very bench she'd served behind for years. She'd worked for this moment her entire life, to be respected, to be seen, to make a difference. That morning, the courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm, lawyers rushing, guards standing tall, and the heavy echo of shoes across polished floors. Danielle smiled at familiar faces, unaware that before the day ended, those same halls would witness her greatest humiliation. Because while she believed the law protected everyone equally, that belief was about to be tested in the harshest way imaginable. It started like any other day, court sessions, paperwork, and a stream of familiar faces. Danielle moved through the halls with her usual quiet confidence, clutching a folder marked confidential, documents she was asked to deliver directly to the courtroom. She didn't think much of it. It was routine. But as she pushed open the heavy doors, something about the air felt different, thicker, colder, charged with tension she couldn't explain. Inside, 2 officers stood near the front bench, whispering with a smirk that didn't belong in a place of justice. She ignored it at first. She had a job to do. But as she placed the folder on the clerk's desk, one of them called out, sharp and dismissive, "This area's restricted. You don't belong here." Danielle turned, startled. "I work here," she said calmly, holding up her ID badge. But instead of apologizing, the officer snatched it from her hand, squinting at it like it was fake. The courtroom went quiet. Every eye turned to watch. "Funny," he said, tilting his head. "Never seen you before." Her heart pounded. She'd worked here for 3 years. These same officers had passed her in the hallway countless times. But in that moment, her position, her title, and her dignity, none of it mattered. All they saw was her skin. She tried to explain, but the second officer stepped closer. "You think you can just walk up to the judge's desk," he said, his voice rising. "You people always have excuses." The words hit her like a slap before the real one ever came. Laughter rippled through the back of the courtroom. A few people looked away, pretending not to see. And then, in one motion that froze time, the officer shoved her shoulder. She stumbled, catching herself against the table. Gasps filled the room. Danielle's eyes burnt, but she didn't cry. She stood straight, fixing her gaze on the men in front of her. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. And then, it happened. The slap. Sudden. Sharp. The sound echoed against marble walls. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Someone shouted for order. Another grabbed their phone, recording. The officers barked commands, trying to twist the story, claiming she'd been aggressive, that she'd crossed a line. Danielle stood there, cheeks stinging, eyes locked on the judge's empty chair. For the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless inside a system she believed in. But somewhere deep inside, something else was rising, a quiet, unshakable fury. She could have walked away. She could have begged or defended herself. But she didn't. Instead, she said nothing, letting the moment burn into the memory of every single person in that room. Minutes later, security escorted her out, no questions, no investigation. Just whispers. Just judgment. Outside, the world went on like nothing happened. But the video from that courtroom? It didn't stay silent. It spread. First across the city, then the country. Millions watched the moment a black woman was humiliated in the House of Justice itself. And as the story broke, something none of those officers expected began to unravel. Because Danielle wasn't just any clerk. She wasn't just another name buried under bureaucracy. Behind that calm exterior was a woman with credentials, experience, and connections that reached far beyond that courtroom's walls. While they laughed, she made calls. While they justified their actions, she gathered witnesses. And while the internet debated who was right, the truth was quietly being documented, every detail, every violation, every face that turned away when she needed them most. By the time the courthouse realized who she truly was, it was too late. Danielle wasn't just a victim anymore, she was the storm they had created. And the next time she walked into that room, she wouldn't be standing on the floor. She'd be walking toward the bench. The very seat where justice had once failed her. Days turned into weeks, and the courtroom where it all happened became a battlefield of silence and denial. The officers had filed their reports, twisting facts to protect themselves. Their version painted Danielle as the aggressor, disruptive, uncooperative, insubordinate. Words that stripped her humanity and replaced it with a stereotype. But what they didn't count on was the truth. The video, the one someone recorded on their phone, was no longer just a clip. It was evidence. It was outrage. It was the moment America couldn't look away. When the internal investigation began, the courthouse buzzed with tension. Danielle returned, not as an employee this time, but as a witness. Cameras followed her every move. The same halls that once echoed with whispers now felt like a stage where justice itself was on trial. As she took her seat, the officers stood across the room, their faces tight, their uniforms suddenly looking like armor for guilt. The judge presiding over the inquiry was one Danielle had admired for years, stern, fair, and known for never bending under pressure. But even he seemed uneasy, shifting in his chair as the footage began to play. The slap echoed again, this time, not through marble walls, but through millions of hearts watching online. Gasps filled the room. Every detail was undeniable now, her calm, their aggression, and the humiliation that followed. For the first time, the power dynamic flipped. The officers avoided her gaze, their confidence cracking under the weight of evidence. And Danielle? She sat still, hands clasped, face steady. Not angry, resolute. But the hardest moment wasn't watching the video. It was listening. Listening to the excuses, the justifications, and the carefully chosen words that tried to soften violence into procedure. Each sentence felt like another blow, another reminder that even with proof, justice was never guaranteed. Then came the breaking point. One of the officers, the one who hit her, stood to speak. His voice trembled slightly, but his words cut cold. I was just doing my job. She didn't follow orders. Danielle looked up, her eyes steady. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze again. Every camera, every eye, every heartbeat waited for her reaction. And then, she spoke, calm but unshakable. If doing your job means assaulting someone because of the color of their skin, maybe it's not the job that's the problem. Maybe it's the system that allows it. The room fell silent. Even the judge didn't move. It was a moment too heavy to interrupt. That was the turning point. The story wasn't just hers anymore. It was every person who had ever been silenced, doubted, or dismissed. The courtroom had become something bigger, a mirror reflecting the truth so many tried to ignore. Weeks later, the courthouse doors opened once more, but this time, the silence that followed wasn't fear. It was respect. Cameras lined the entrance as Danielle walked through, her head high, her black robe catching the light. The same halls where she'd been humiliated now echoed with applause. Justice, for once, had turned around. After the investigation, the officers were dismissed. The court issued a public apology. And the clip that once showed her pain now symbolized something else: accountability. But Danielle didn't stop there. She used her platform to push for reform, mandatory bias training, stricter courtroom conduct policies, and equal representation inside the justice system. Her name became a voice, not just a story. Still, the victory came with scars. Every time she sat on the bench, she remembered that moment, the sting, the silence, the disbelief. But she turned that memory into purpose. She made sure no one in her courtroom ever felt small, unseen, or unheard. Outside, her story spread far beyond that city. It became a headline, then a movement, then a reminder that change isn't made by power, it's made by courage. People began to ask harder questions. About who gets believed. About who gets protected. About how many others had stories that never made it to video. Danielle's rise wasn't revenge. It was restoration. She didn't want to punish anyone, she wanted to prove something. That dignity can't be stripped away by a uniform. That justice has no color. That even in a broken system, one person's truth can shake the walls of silence. Her journey reminds us of something simple but powerful: racism doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a suit, a robe, or a title. And fighting it means standing firm even when the world expects you to fall. Danielle's story started with a slap, but it ended with a seat of power. And through her, justice found its voice again. Because in the end, this story isn't just about one woman. It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong, and found the strength to take that place anyway. So the question is, how many more Danielles will it take before we stop calling this justice and start making it real? If this story moved you, don't scroll away, share it, talk about it, and help keep her message alive. Because real change starts when we stop being silent.